Hey guys, so we're going to look at our notes over pages 628 through 629. So the last video was about how organisms group together to form populations, and different populations make up communities, and how when we start looking at the abiotic factors and how they affect the community, we're dealing with ecosystems. So I started out with a picture of a bunch of different ecosystems here, and maybe by the end of this unit we'll get into some of those different ecosystems and the biomes that they make up. But today we really want to focus in on some more information with populations, because ecologists study populations and those population densities quite a bit. So in your book, on page 628, you did a little reading about population densities. Population density is just how many of an organism that you have living in a certain area at a certain time. So this is a map of the United States, and it's showing population density of people. So how do you calculate this population density? It is a really easy, like third grade math problem. Okay, so you're going to count all of the organisms that are in a population, and then you're going to divide them by how much space they're taking up, or the area. So let's talk a little bit about some elementary school math. So how do you find the area of a square or a rectangle? Okay, so hopefully you're saying length times width. So for what we're going to be doing basic population counts of plants. And the reason that we're choosing plants is because plants don't move. So right now, the population density of people in the United States, you're probably seeing some stuff about that with census information, where they're trying to count the people in the United States, and then they'll figure out where they are heavily populated and not heavily populated, just doing a simple math problem like this. Now, a lot of organisms, it's very difficult to get an exact population density count because we can't count all of them. So there's lots of different ways. You may have seen with some birds, especially if I have some hunters out there, you may have seen some tagging that they do, where they tag and band the birds and then release them. That's to help come up with population densities. They're still trying to figure out how many in a certain area. You may have seen Fish and Wildlife before doing population densities. They sometimes will go out in a boat and they will shock the water. And when they shock the water, the fish and snakes and whatever else will float to the surface. It doesn't hurt them. It just kind of stuns them for a minute. When they float to the surface, they're able to count the number of organisms that normally they wouldn't be able to see, or they'd be swimming around. And then they're able to divide that by the area of the lake or the river that they're in to come up with that population density count. So there's lots of different techniques and ways to do this with animals that have a tendency to move around. But again, we're going to do a population density count tomorrow for your lab with plants, because plants are much easier to count because they do not move on us, okay? But it's the same basic principle. If we wanted to know how many fish were in the pond approximately, or if we wanted to know how many trees were in the forest, or for us, how many weeds are in your yard, you're going to take the number of organisms and you're going to divide it by the area. So again, you're going to count the number of organisms by whatever technique you have. We're just going to be counting them. But we talked about how you could band birds, or how we might shock fish in a pond, and there are many other techniques. And then we're going to divide that by the possible area. Now, why are ecologists interested in population density? So why even look at this? So the size of a population, right here I'm moving the mouse around in the middle. The size of the population, they're always changing, okay? So whether we're talking about the census report that many people are filling out, or an example of fish in an area, we're trying to look at how healthy the community is. So we're always going to be looking at, as ecologists, how many organisms are moving into an area, and that's immigration. How many organisms are moving out of the area? This is a word that you've probably heard before, mortality. How many organisms in that population are regularly passing away or dying? And then natality refers to how many are being born in that area. So ecologists study these population densities because it tells us how the population is fluctuating. If the population density is increasing or if it's decreasing, it speaks a little bit to the healthiness of the community and the number of organisms that it can support. Okay. So let's go to limiting factors here. So limiting factors are anything that helps to control a population. You're not going to be able to support an indefinite number of organisms because there just wouldn't be enough resources. So things that we think of as resources also become limiting factors to control these populations. So to keep the populations in check with one another. And that's on page 629 in your book where it gets into limiting factors. So some of the things that help to control different populations are the amount of food. If we get too many organisms, there's not going to be enough food and there will be a scarcity, and so the population would begin to decrease. If we get more food, then a community can support more organisms and a population would increase. So any of these resources would definitely act as limiting factors. So food, water, the amount of space. Different organisms have different vital resources. And then also another limiting factor is diseases. Diseases definitely spread throughout populations, and they do limit the number that are there. So when we say limit, it's kind of like a speed limit sign. That's the maximum number of organisms that you're going to be able to support in your ecosystem. So along with limiting factors, you have another vocabulary word, and that's carrying capacity. So in an ecosystem, you're going to have fluctuations up and down, and many times with plants and animals, especially in the temperate climate we live in, that happens seasonally. So you're going to have changes. I'm showing you right here. So this is showing all different kinds of organisms. There's going to be months where their population density is going to be lower, months where they increase because look, food supply is increasing, so we are able to support more organisms. We have a lot of births in the spring. Then as food supply decreases, you're going to have something that begins to go down. So these are all our limiting factors, okay? Not having enough food, if there's a disease, of course, just accidents, changes in the weather, all different types of limiting factors. But the word carrying capacity is over a long extended amount of time, the number of organisms that an environment can support. So if you see this bottom red bar back here, okay? So no matter what month of the year it is, this is our carrying capacity. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as the breeding stock. This is the number of organisms that over an extended amount of time that we can support in that environment. Okay, so we've talked about population density, the number of organisms in a certain area. Okay, so that's what our lab's going to be about tomorrow. And then limiting factors. Without those limiting factors, populations will increase and increase and increase and increase. And when we start to remove these resources, populations are going to decline. Over a long period of time, the base number of organisms that an area can support is known as the carrying capacity. So let's look at our lab tomorrow on how to calculate population densities. So here's some common weeds, just weeds that hopefully you have somewhere around your house or in your neighbor's yard or in a ditch, or you just can pick any kind of weed you want. I just picked 3 common ones. Here's some dandelions. And I found over the years that a lot of students don't know the entire life cycle of a dandelion, so I'm going to post a video about that. It's a really short animation, like a minute or so, that I want you guys to watch as well. This is purple henbit, or you may find some dead nettle, which looks pretty similar. Here's some wild green onions, but really whatever weed you can find in your yard is going to be absolutely fine for this lab tomorrow. So you're going to identify a population tomorrow. And then you're going to measure out an area. So the directions in tomorrow's lab will tell you how to do that. And I've got a little video that shows you how to do that as well. And you're going to go outside and you're going to measure off an area. And then you're going to count the number of organisms. and then you're going to do the math to find the population density of a certain type of organism that's in your yard. So that's our lab where we're going to practice population densities tomorrow. We'll get a chance to do a little bit of math as we calculate population density and also area. So it's a nice connection with Mr. Lacey and Miss Taylor's classes as well. So if you have questions, make sure that you join me on the Zooms and we can talk about population densities and limiting factors and carrying capacities, and we can also talk about your lab tomorrow. Bye, guys.